Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people in the webinar. And let's get started. This is an important topic as it relates to how we're going to leave the planet for future generations. Therefore, it's worth serious study because we need solid data upon which to make sound decisions. What concerns me as a scientist is that people have strong, passionate views in a complete absence of data. They base their reviews on internet gossip with no scientific citations, so we can't tell what's true and what isn't true. My answer was to go and look for the science. The majority of people tend to go and look only for evidence to support their preconceived opinions and stop there. But as a scientist, at least the professional ones, they don't do that. They have to read everything they can find and then only make up their mind based on the evidence once they've read absolutely everything there is there from both sides. It's a lot more work to do it that way, but that's the way I did it, and that's why I had to read about 400 articles to write the book. And I'm talking about peer-reviewed scientific articles here, not gossip pieces. I condensed all of that into a book so everyone can see what I found, and hopefully that will lead to wise policies for the future. I want to mention that I'm a scientist. I'm not a lobbyist. I don't make plastics, I don't sell them, and I don't market them. And I did all of this with no funding whatsoever. Nobody's paying me not a single cent to do this. I know that some people on this call are ardently against my message, even before I've spoken. That's understandable because they've had a decade of misinformation without any pushback. And studies show that if you repeat a lie enough times, people will believe it. A religious fervor has overcome a large group of enthusiastic people. Enthusiasm and virtue can be wonderful, but only when directed wisely. I hope that anyone who truly cares about the environment cares enough to really listen to the science and consider it. Try to blank out everything that you've been told and really listen to the data, because everything I'm going to say is backed by peer-reviewed science. I know that's a very hard task and not many people can do it. It's very, very hard to change your mind and open your mind, but I hope that some of you can. If you're against plastics, quite frankly, I understand why. But ask yourself this: how many peer-reviewed scientific articles have you read? Are you an expert on plastic materials? Most people have never seen the facts until now. I'm going to try and go through and mention, at least touch upon, every single chapter in the book, because if you miss any of these topics, you don't really get the complete picture. So you have to touch upon degradation, litter, waste, the environment, what's green, what isn't green, and the motivations behind why we've got so much interesting disinformation in front of us. So let's get cracking. At least we will if I can turn the page. Here we go. So here's an example, right? Americans use about 500 million straws a day. That was repeated by the USA Today, CNN, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and the New York Times. Where did that information come from? It was made up by a 9-year-old schoolboy called Milo Kress. He pulled a number out of the air. He said he made a few phone calls. He kept no record of those phone calls. And he convinced everybody in the whole world that Americans were using 500 million straws a day. That number was wrong in the end, but nobody thought to check it, right? This is sensationalist journalism. People believe what they want to believe, and it sounded dramatic, and everybody picked it up. This is the kind of nonsense that we've been brainwashed with for 10 years. And as a scientist, I find that completely unacceptable, because if we start with nonsense, we're going to make policies based on nonsense, and they're going to be counterproductive. So this is one example, but there's loads more, right? There's going to be more plastic than fish in the sea. That's been debunked. There's tons of other things, and they're all nonsense when you check into them, but nobody is checking. People only care about this sensationalist stuff and the hype because it's exciting. And the truth is maybe less exciting, but it's what we need if we're going to forge a path ahead. Okay, so that's nonsense, and I've got a list of other things which have been proven to be nonsense at the end. So what is green? That's the first question, right? This is how I think about things, right? First find what's green, and then try to use that material as much as possible, and make less waste, recycle it, reuse it, and so on. That's the way that I think is a logical way to approach things. So let's start off with what is green, and let's start with something that everyone knows about: plastic bags. And that's what we're going to talk about first. So here's a life cycle analysis. These are not perfect, but this is the only known and accepted way to tell what's green and what isn't. Governments use it, companies use it, Greenpeace even uses it, right? So this is the only accepted way. It's not perfect, but it adds up all of the materials, all the pollution, all of the transportation, It even includes recycling at the end of life and all of this kind of stuff, right? And this is an ISO standard where everybody has to follow the same rules. They get the data from the same databases and all of this kind of stuff, right? So this is not perfect, but it is accepted, and it's the only tool we have to tell. Otherwise, we might as well just toss a coin, right, and say, hey, my product's greenest because it's mine. This is the only way that we really have. So, and it works. And to be extra sure, it's good to look at more than one life cycle analysis, right? Don't believe any one, because anyone can have bias. Make sure you look at more than one. So here we go. This is what a life cycle analysis entails, and it's a lot of money, so you won't find it for every product. But let's take a look at plastic bags. I went looking to see, because everyone talked about plastic bags, I went looking to see, had there ever been a life cycle analysis? Here are the lovely plastic bags. And what did I find? I found about 8 or 10. They're all posted on my website, and they're in the book. And every single one concluded that plastic bags were greenest. Every one ever published, right? I'm not cherry picking here. Every one, 8 or 10 of them, they're all listed. You can follow the links. You can read them yourself. And this is quotes word for word from every one. So cotton bags were disastrous. You needed to reuse them 200 or 250 times to break even with a plastic bag. The paper bags were much worse. And so every single study says we should be using plastic bags. So this makes you wonder, right? Why are we having all these bag bans? Have the politicians not seen this? Has Greenpeace not seen it? What is going on? Because you can go into Google right now after the talk and type in LCA plastic bag or LCA grocery bag or life cycle analysis grocery bag, and you will get the same hits I did. I even challenged somebody to find one that I hadn't found, and they couldn't, right? A PhD chemist couldn't find any that I hadn't found. Every single one, these are 4 of them, but there are 8 or 10, says that plastics win. So why are we banning plastic bags if they're unequivocally the greenest solution on the planet using the same methods that Greenpeace and governments use? That's a mystery to me. Okay, next slide. So here's an example, right? The guy who invented the plastic bag, he did it to save trees, right? He was concerned. He's a Swedish guy. He took a patent 100 years ago. He wanted to save trees by using plastic instead. If we want to replace a plastic bag with paper, we need 2.7 times more energy, 1.5 times more carbon dioxide will be made, and 17 times more water is used. So this is a tremendous amount of harm done by moving from plastic to paper. And this is what we're being encouraged to do. I weighed a Kroger bag. Their plastic bag weighs 5.5 grams, and their paper bag from the same company, from Kroger, weighs 60 grams. So you're going from 5.5 grams of waste to 60 grams of waste, and wasting water, and wasting energy, and creating more CO2. And somehow politicians and green groups think that's a great plan. It doesn't make any sense to me. And you can see on the right here is the link to the place where I found this. So I'm not one of these journalists, right, who pops up something for a few quick clicks and leaves it at that. I had to do a tremendous amount of work. It took me a year to read all of this stuff and present you with the data and present you with the link so you can go and check the scientific citations to verify all of this for yourself. But as you see, this is in inverted commas. I'm literally quoting word for word because otherwise somebody's going to accuse me of spin. So I quote wherever I can, word for word, verbatim from every single report. And you see, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so here's an example that comes up all the time. I see this on LinkedIn every week. Somebody's asking, should we go from PET bottles to glass or aluminium? You know, glass and aluminium, we can remelt them. Aren't they wonderful? They must be the best solution. So what does the life cycle analysis say? I've got more than one of these, but here's just one of them. And we see that if we were to go from PET at the bottom here with a value of 11 energy units to aluminium, we've got about 50% more energy used. If we go to glass, it's about 2.5 times more energy to make a glass bottle. If we look at greenhouse gases, we're more than doubling the greenhouse gas if we go from PET to aluminium. And this is for the same volume of drink contained, right? This has all been normalized, so it's not like different sizes or anything. It's the same volume of drink. Does this sound sensible to you? I mean, who is going to queue up to be using 50% more energy, generating double the waste, and using 2 or 3 times, creating 2 or 3 times more the CO2? It doesn't make sense. Nobody's checking these facts. Everybody's going by gut feeling, and gut feeling just isn't good enough when it comes to the environment. This is the future of our children we're talking about here. People can at least bother to check the facts before they make wild decisions that will have consequences for future generations. So this is in the book, and at the end of this talk, there will be free access to everybody who attended through the SPE for the book, so you can all read everything online with even more science. and so forth. So this is not something I'm doing for money, right? I did all of this work for free. Not a single penny was given to me, and I'm giving away the book for free because I care about having solid facts out there and not making policies based on fantasy. Okay, so here's an example. It would be a bad idea and cause a tremendous amount of harm to go from PET to glass. And this is another misconception, right? This is how people are approaching recycling now, right? They say, okay, glass and aluminium can be recycled indefinitely, they say, right? So therefore, let's use those. And I'm thinking, what kind of crazy mentality is that? Let's take the two worst materials we can think of and use them again and again and again, burning through that amount of energy and creating waste and all of the rest of it again and again and again. Why would you pick the least green materials and decide to use them for infinity? That is ridiculous. What you want to do is take the PET bottle, because it has the lowest impact, and recycle that. And they are collected and recycled 12 times mechanically. You know, you just melt them, make a new bottle or something else. And then at the end of that, you chemically recycle it. You dissolve the PET and you reform new PET. So it's also infinitely recyclable. And it's not fantasy. People are doing a lot of that right now. Okay, so there's another myth dispelled. Why are we moving from the greenest solution again to something not as green? And here's an example, right? Hopefully everyone's seen this. We know that to make glass, we're melting sand, right? We're talking a couple thousand degrees here. Things are glowing red hot. And this is where a lot of the environmental impact comes from. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to look at that molten lava, basically, to make a piece of glass and realize that is a whopping amount of energy. And that's what's coming out in the life cycle analysis. We're burning huge amounts of coal and other forms of electricity to create these glass bottles because they have to be melted. It doesn't make sense. The same thing for metal. Here's metal making process, right? I mean, you don't have to be Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking to realize that that is a hot process, right? There's a giant amount of energy going into that, and that's why it's not green. Okay, so just to sum up, if we were to take the United States alone and replace plastic bottles, we would be doing a lot of damage. So plastics are saving enough fuel to fuel 18 million passenger vehicles, to fill 500,000 Olympic swimming pools, and so on. So going from plastics, people are always saying, I'm removing plastic, right? I replaced plastic. I reduced my plastic consumption by 1,000 tons. And they never tell you, oh yeah, I replaced it with 4,000 tons of cardboard, right? Whenever you're removing plastic, you have to think, what are you replacing it with? What's the impact and how much waste are you generating? Okay, and again, see at the bottom, here's the quotation where you can go and look up these things. Just put them into Google or check on my website and it will take you right to those reports so you can read it for yourself. So having read about 50 life cycle analyses or 100, I don't know how many, it's a lot, trends start to emerge. So officially for a life cycle analysis, you have to take, let's say, a PET bottle. You have to say, I'm based in wherever, Chicago. And you have to add up all the transportation and where's the nearest PET manufacturing plant based on your location, based on that specific item. It's a lot of work and it's specific only to where you are, right? So it varies. So you can't say that this is the greenest product there and it's necessarily the greenest somewhere else. But what you can do is look at a lot of life cycle analyses, as I did, and try to get an idea what the ranking is. And this is the ranking that comes out. The greenest material is wood, right? If you take wood decking, for example, it beats the pants out of plastic for greenness. Just a chunk of wood, right? You take a chunk of wood, you saw those pieces of lumber, put it down as decking, and that beats plastic decking. And it's the same for corks, wine corks, right? A natural piece of cork is greener in life cycle analysis than a plastic cork, right? And why would I tell you that? If I was some plastic nut, I would say plastic was the best for everything, but I'm not. I'm a real scientist who wants to tell you what I find, whether or not it suits a particular cause, right? I don't have an agenda other than to get you some facts. So wood beats the pants out of plastic. The trouble with wood is we can't make everything out of wood. We can't make mobile phones out of it. We can't make our cars out of it because they would weigh too much and burn too much oil and so forth. So wood is kind of limited in what we can use it for. But when you can use wood or plastic, and there's not too much, shaping and stuff going on, too much other things happening, just a chunk of wood, basically, it will beat plastic pretty much every time. So plastic usually beats cardboard. So for example, if I look at shopping bags, grocery bags, plastic wins. If I look at mailing envelopes, that's been looked at and plastic wins again. So if you look at banknotes, plastic wins every time as well. So there are cases where I've seen paper beating plastic, but it seems to be, in general, plastic is the greenest solution. Then we got paper and cardboard. And then we got steel, that beats aluminium, and that beats glass. So that's just an idea, right? If you don't have a life cycle analysis because they haven't been done for everything and you're not sure, this is a good kind of rule of thumb. And another way you can look at it is, which is the cheapest product, right? Because if you think about what goes into a life cycle analysis, it's materials cost and the amount of time it takes to get them and the transportation and the energy and all of that. And if you add all those things up, you end up with more or less the cost to make the material. So it's not a perfect analogy, but if you're in a store and you're looking at a paper straw and it costs twice as much as a plastic one and it weighs twice as much, you can be sure the plastic one is greener. Okay, so we've looked at what's greenest, and we found out that plastics are usually greenest. That's interesting, right? That's not what we're being told because no one's bothering to check. Now let's look at waste, right? So as soon as you tell somebody, and I've had this, you tell them plastic's greenest, they go, oh, well, I don't care. What about the waste? So I had to go and read 50 or 100 articles about waste. And what did I find? This is the image that we're given online. We are told that we're drowning in waste. There's this guy and he's just drowning in waste. It's all due to plastic, right? This is what we're told. So what's the reality? This is taken right from the EPA website. You can go right there after the talk and look at these numbers yourself. And this is household trash in the USA. And what do we see? A couple of things leap out. One is that there's a lot of types of waste. And another one is that plastics are about 13%. Paper and cardboard in comparison is about double that. So that's interesting, right? If you had $1 million or if you wanted to do good, right? Let's say you wanted to save the world from waste and you looked at this pie chart, would you spend 99% of your effort talking about and acting on and legislating 13% of the problem, right? That doesn't make sense, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about waste. We definitely should. But why would 99% of the LinkedIn posts and the media articles and the TV shows be about plastics when it's only 13% of the problem? If you want to address this pie chart, surely we should be looking at all of these areas and trying to do something that's good for the planet, make the biggest impact. I mean, if you had only a limited amount of money, you'd probably be looking at paper and cardboard and saying, hey, we have to do something about that. It's out of control. But nobody is doing that. Nobody's thinking logically. Nobody's checking the facts. And that's worrying to me as a scientist. Okay, so here's some more data from the EPA. There's the link at the bottom. You can go and find it yourself. And we see this is the total waste generation in millions of tons in blue against the waste per capita, like pounds per person per day in black. And what we find is that waste was going up and up and up until about the 90s, and then it's sort of leveled off. When we're told that we're drowning in waste, right, this is getting worse and worse, and it's not true, right? The actual waste production per person and overall waste production has actually leveled off. Nobody will tell you that, but it's right there on the EPA website. And they studied this and they said, well, what's going on? It used to be that we were making more and more waste per person, and now it's leveled off. What changed? What changed in the 90s to make that happen? And so the references at the bottom here, the role of plastics in decoupling municipal waste and economic growth in the USA. And what did they find when they analyzed the data? They found that plastics consumption increased 84 times between 1960 and 2013. And you would think, holy moly, that's a problem, right? Plastic waste has gone up. But what they found out was that the plastic was replacing a lot of other material. So the overall waste consumption went down. Plastic is actually reduced waste. That was their dramatically reduced waste. That is their conclusion. And this is a peer-reviewed paper, right? So this is interesting. You can understand how the public got the wrong idea about plastics, because at the same time as plastic production and use was going up by 80 times, they must have been like, wow, the world's drowning in plastic. But what they didn't see was 1 pound of plastic replaced 3 or 4 pounds of something else. And so the overall waste went down, and nobody's paid attention to that. That's very, very important. So now we know plastics are 12% of waste, and they've dramatically reduced waste, right? So why would you be so ardently against plastics if you look at the facts and see that, of course, I'm not for waste. Waste is not a good idea. We should all act to reduce waste. But plastics is definitely not the problem. If anything, it's a solution. Here's an example, right? People will say to you, naively maybe, let's remove plastics. And what would happen? We know it takes 3 to 4 pounds of other material. There's a link on the right to tell you the report that I'm drawing this from. 3 to 4 pounds of replacement to replace 1 pound of plastic. So here on the left, we have all of this pie chart broken down. Let's take away the blue plastic part. We've got a gap here. And this looks like great. Look at this. We've removed plastic. We've saved the world. Look at that reduction. But what we actually find is that we've replaced plastic with 3 or 4 times more of these other materials, and now we've got way more overall waste like we had in the old days before plastics came on the scene. So that would be a tremendously bad idea. It sounds good at first thought, but it just doesn't add up. Okay. So we're told in the Western world, right? You're monsters. You're creating a problem. We hear nothing but that we're terrible people in the US and in Europe and so forth, and that we're creating all this waste and we're bad people, right? So let's look at a graph. This is from Our World in Data. You can check the link at the bottom, and we see that that's right. America and Europe and the other more developed countries, let's say, they generate more waste. And so we're monsters, right? We have to feel terrible. We have to open our wallets. We have to give money to charities and so forth and make our conscience feel better. But let's look at the next graph, right? Which looks at the mismanagement of that waste. Where is waste mismanaged? Oh, there's none mismanaged in the USA or Canada or Europe or Australia. Even though these places are making a large amount of waste, they are not mismanaging it. It's being mismanaged in these other countries which haven't caught up, right? They don't have recycling facilities. They don't have as many trash cans as they need. Maybe their government's wasted their money on something else or whatever. They're just chronologically behind us, right? We can see that Europe and America and other places have had long enough to put all these infrastructure in place, and there doesn't have to be a mismanagement of waste. We're not doing it, and it won't be the case in those countries either in, let's say, 10 or 20 years, especially if we help them, right? So we don't have to feel that bad in these countries because although we're generating waste, we're not really responsible for a lot of the mismanaged waste. So it's not as bad for the environment as you would think. And I know some people on this call are thinking, oh, but you're shipping your waste to other countries and disposing of it there. Some of that is happening, and that's not a good thing. It's being legislated against, but it's a very, very small proportion compared to the overall numbers we're looking at here. So that doesn't come anywhere near close to explaining this difference between waste generated and mismanaged waste. So it's something that's being legislated against, and it's getting ameliorated all the time. So why would they focus on the Americans and the Europeans and make them feel bad? Why is it that we are being pummeled all the time with what bad people we are and how we need to do more? Probably because that's where the money is, right? So if you're an environmental group and you want to get a load of money, there's no better way than to make the rich people feel bad and hope that they open their pockets to appease their conscience. That's where the money is, and so that's where they devote their promotional activities, even though that's not where the problem is. Okay, so we've looked at what's green and waste, and we got a message which is very, very different. It's factual, and it's very different to what we're told. And now let's look at litter, because that's the next thing someone will say to you. What about the litter? I don't care about the other two things. Now you've shown me that. I'm worried about litter. And this is an interesting one. First of all, I got to say that the plastic bag is about the ugliest thing I've ever seen, right? I'm a plastic material scientist, but I just find them ugly. They're just so incredibly unappealing to look at. And the other thing is it's kind of an optical illusion. Both of the images you see here are 5 grams of plastic, right? On the left, we've got 5.5 gram Kroger bag. And on the right, we've got a 5.5 gram game die from a gaming board, right? And you can see that the plastic bag's kind of an optical illusion because although it's only 5 grams of plastic, it takes a giant amount of visual space. So when you see one outside, you think, good God, what an amazing amount of pollution or litter. And it really isn't. It's only a very small amount. So because plastics are so very effective, and we've worked to make these bags thinner and thinner and lighter and more efficient over decades, it generates this illusion that there's way more plastic waste than there really is. So that's one thing to think about. And it's ugly, right? You look at it and you just go, wow, that's not appealing. So what's responsible for this litter, right? We see the guy on the left is a good citizen and the person on the right is not. And they've done studies on this. They film this every year. They literally go out in cars and they film people littering. And they find out that over 80% of litter in US is dropped intentionally, right? So you can literally stand there and film them dropping the litter, even near a trash can, right? So you can go and find the numbers for this at Keep America Beautiful and other places. People are standing there and intentionally dropping this litter. And then guess what they do? They turn around and they blame Coca-Cola, they blame Nestle, they blame, I don't know, the apple orchard. It's unbelievable how ridiculous these people are. I mean, even my children can understand if I drop a Coke can on the floor, that's not Coke's responsibility, that's my fault. I mean, this is something that children can grasp, and I don't know why people are so crazy about getting away from blaming themselves and looking in the mirror that they'll blame anyone else. They want this extended supplier responsibility. They want Coke to come and pick up your cans after you. they'll have your shoe company coming and tying your laces for you next. I don't follow the logic. In the Western world, usually we drop litter only to a very small extent, and what we do drop is, cleaned up using our taxes, and that's how it's going to work in the other countries too, as soon as they catch up. Okay, so here's an example, right? People will say, I don't believe you. I don't believe that that litter is due to people. Prove it to me. And here's a proof, right? Most people don't know that for decades, a large proportion of the banknotes have been made of plastic. They've done it for decades in Australia and several other countries because they're a lot more durable, right? And they're greener too, according to every study that they've done. So let's talk about these banknotes. There's 8 billion printed a year, plastic ones, right? That's one per person in the world every year, right? How many do you see on the street when you go for a walk? How many do you see on the beach when you go on a holiday? Right? These things float, right? They're small, they're easily lost. There's one printed per person in the world every year, and you've never seen one, have you? I haven't. I'm over 50. I've never once seen one of these plastic banknotes or any banknote on the floor. So people only litter when the object has no value, right? These are small, easily lost pieces of plastic, but because they have a value, people are careful with them and they don't drop them. So this proves to you that people are littering. And the exact same logic applies to credit cards. Everyone in America has on average 2.5 credit cards, right? Every adult. And you never find them, right? I've never found one on the ground. And if one were to land on the ground, it would kind of clean itself up by magic because it has a value, the same as the money. So this very simple example shows us categorically, undeniably, that litter is due to people and not due to the plastic. Because if it was due to the plastic, we'd be drowning in plastic banknotes. Okay, so here's another thing about litter, right? This is what we see when we go on holiday. This is a tourist beach. We see all of that litter and we think it's coming from the sea, but it isn't. It's coming from the tourists. You can see the people back here, right? This is a tourist resort. And it's been proven that all of this litter, almost 100% of it, comes from the tourists. And you know what they do? They clutter up the beach until it's horrible, and then they leave it because they say, this is ugly, I don't want to go on holiday here anymore, and they go to another pristine beach and mess that one up, right? So, but of course, they can never blame themselves, these people. They can't admit that that's their own litter, right? So they would never say that, and they assume that it's coming from the ocean, from other people, and so forth. And let's take a look instead at, people study these beaches, right? These studies go on for decades, so we know exactly what's on all these beaches and where it came from. Let's look at a non-tourist beach. Let's look at an isolated beach that people can't get to easily. This is what it looks like, right? And you know it, right? You've been on holiday in a place like this. An isolated beach has either no litter, or if it does have some litter, it won't be, you won't really find bottles and cans or cigarettes or any of that stuff. What you find is a bit of fishing equipment. You'll find fishing nets. That's what they find when they look at isolated beaches where there's no tourists. So this is a misconception, right? Of course, you go to the tourist beach. That's the one by definition that you go to. That's where tourists go, right? So you see that beach, and that's what you think all beaches look like. And there's some huge problem. And yet you go to all these other beaches, and there really is no big problem because there's no tourists there dropping all their rubbish. So and this has been studied, and I give the references in my book. Okay, so here's the blame problem, right? A guy drives his car into the tree, and the last thing he wants to do is blame himself, right? He'll do anything. The tree jumped in front of me, right? The car suddenly skidded off to the side. The tires burst. But no, if you really want to address a problem, you have to look at yourself, right? Address the real problem. If you blame the tree or blame the car, or in the case of plastic, you blame Coca-Cola or blame Nestle or whoever, or P&G, Unilever, any of these companies, it's just childish. I mean, come on. This is obvious. If you drop a piece of litter, that's your fault. You bought the product, and you shouldn't drop it. Expecting Coke or anyone to come and clean up your litter, to me, just doesn't make sense. It's the same as at the end of life. I don't expect Levi's to come and get my jeans. I don't expect Ford to come and pick up my car when I'm finished with it. You buy a product, it's yours, and you dispose of it properly. Maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems that simple to me. Okay, so we looked at a lot of topics, and now the next big one is ocean litter and microplastics. Everyone's freaking out about microplastics. This is the one area that when I started to read the papers, I actually got concerned because I was like, wow, there's a lot of papers that claim to show harm, right? You can see it in the abstract, you can see it in the title, you can see people talking about it online. And I thought, wow, maybe this whole thing is going to blow up here when I start to read these papers, and maybe there's going to really be something that is frightening. So I really looked at these papers. I downloaded every one I could find, and let me show you what I found. This is what we're told is the case, but that's not really the case when you look at the data. This is what you really find, right? So this is a summary of decades of work by many, many groups, right? Trawling up and down in boats with nets, fishing plastic out of the sea and measuring it. And what you find is that in these in the open sea, that's these lower things, right, outside of the gyres, you get maybe 20, 50 grams of plastic per square kilometer, which is really, really low, right? I'll try and convert these into numbers that might make more sense to you in a second. And then even in the middle of these, they call them patches or gyres, right? We see these pictures online of these giant floating islands the size of Texas that are supposed to be out in the sea, right? The concentration in those gyres is, as you can see, let's say 500 grams. So about a pound of plastic per square kilometer, right? Even in the highest concentrated areas, which they call patches, that's the concentration, 500 grams per square kilometer. That doesn't mean a lot to people, so let me convert that into other numbers. So they've been monitored for decades, as I said. They claim to be huge floating islands, but the people who've studied them said there's not nearly enough plastic there to even call it an island or a patch or a soup. It would be the weakest soup you've ever had. If you ordered that soup, it would just be a clear bowl of water. So let me give you some perspective. 500 grams per square kilometer is 2 pounds a square mile if you're living in the US, right? So if I convert that into something you can picture, right? If we took an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water, that would be less than 1 game die in that whole Olympic-sized pool. That's the maximum concentration that you'll find in those gyres, right? And I'm not saying it should be there, right? It definitely shouldn't be there. It's still pollution, but it's not a giant floating island, and it's not going to tangle up, it's not, you can swim through it and you can't tell it's there. You can sail through it. You don't even know it's there, right? We're talking about, on average, not in the gyres now, but average in the sea, one very small piece of plastic, like your little fingernail, per 130 bathtubs of water, right? That is the weakest soup I've ever heard of. So I'm not defending pollution, but what I am saying is if we want to address a problem, let's not start with a bunch of lies, right? Because lies just make people excited, and they may make them open their pockets and give money to their favorite environmental group, but it doesn't help us address a problem. If we're adults and we want to do the right thing for our kids, let's not start with a bunch of lies and base policies based on that. Let's look at actual numbers, and these are rock solid numbers. Okay, so we've looked at these imaginary floating islands which don't exist. And let's look at the next thing, microplastics. We're told that these microplastics are poisoning the fish. Is that true? I decided to look at it. So what we find in these studies is that the studies are just junk science. It's some of the worst science I've ever seen in my life. These people should literally be, in my opinion, fired. That's how bad the science is. So what do I mean by that, right? It's a strong accusation. How do I say that as a scientist, as a professional scientist? So I'm a scientist who's reviewed scientific papers, right? I'm one of the ones who gets asked to say whether they should be published or not, right? And this is just horrendous work that never should have been published. I'll tell you why, right? The plastic that's actually in the ocean is polyethylene and polypropylene. That's the vast majority. You can find the exact numbers in my book. It's like, I don't know, from memory, like 90% polyethylene and polypropylene. What does that mean, right? I mean, polyethylene is a Ziploc bag, right? We eat out of it. It's food contact safe. Polypropylene is like the original Tupperware, polypropylene, right? These are two of the safest materials we know. That's what the vast majority of microplastics in the ocean is. But when they do these studies, they don't do them on those plastics. They pick a completely different type of plastic. Why do they do that, right? It's meaningless. If I want to know if apples are safe, I don't go and study cherries, right? That would be preposterous. And yet that's what these people have done. Instead of studying the plastics which are actually in the ocean, they went and studied a type of plastic which doesn't exist anywhere in the ocean. And that's cross-linked polystyrene particles. So isn't it preposterous? Can you even believe what you're hearing? Literally look at the experimental section of 80% of the studies in this area, and you'll see that they use the wrong kind of plastic. But that wasn't enough for them, right? They used up to 100 million times more than you actually find in the ocean, right? So let's say I want to know if apples are safe. I feed you an apple a day for 10 years and I see if you're still okay, right? If I fed you 100 million apples a day, right, that wouldn't look good, would it? And it wouldn't be because apples are poisonous. It would be because I just overwhelmed you with apples. You'd probably explode after the 100th one. So they use the wrong size of particles. They use the ones with the wrong surface science, the wrong surface charge. They use ones which have got toxins in them. And they use ones which are fluorescent. So fish are actually attracted to them because they're fluorescing, right? Which real microplastic doesn't. It's hard to imagine how they could have done these experiments worse. It's like they must have just been so dying to come up with a bad result, or they're the world's worst scientists. It's absolutely shocking. These people should be ashamed of the science that they've done. I'm ashamed for them as a scientist. So this is most of the science that's been done. But what happens when they do it right? So there are some studies where they actually looked at the toxicity of polyethylene and polypropylene. And what did they find? Oh, no problem. No toxicity whatsoever, right? Fish eat them, goes right through, no change. Why? Because it's food safe, edible plastic. But that wasn't enough for some people, right? I found one study or two studies where they took polyethylene and polypropylene. They showed it was safe, but they didn't stop there. What did they do then? Then they soaked the polyethylene and polypropylene beads in poison. And then they fed it to the fish and said, oh, look, the fish got sick. The plastic's poisonous. And I'm like, the plastic isn't poisonous. I could soak anything in poison and then put it in with the fish. I could pour the poison, like the last slide, I could pour the poison right on the fish and kill it, right? That's easy. That doesn't prove the plastic is toxic. That proves that you shouldn't have soaked it in poison. And so what happens in the sea, and some people have pointed this out, what actually happens in the sea is that you have microplastics, which shouldn't be there. I'm not saying that they should, but what they do is absorb the chemicals, the toxic chemicals you find in the sea get absorbed into those microplastics, and that ends up protecting the fish, right? Because it's no longer in the water, it's stuck inside the plastic. So it soaks up that toxin. This is absolutely proven and protects the fish. Even if the fish eats the plastic, the toxin remains within the microplastic and the fish is protected. So the real story is microplastics are a miracle cure to save the fish, right? That could have been an equally valid headline, but of course that wouldn't have got as many reads. So they came up with this distorted science to try and make there look like there was a problem when there wasn't one. So this is absolutely appalling, and I hope there are serious consequences for these people. Okay, so we've addressed a lot of topics. We're getting nearer to the end now. Let's look at degradation. And this is the reason that this whole thing kicked off for me, right? I did this, as I said, without pay. But one day, my kids came home from school, and they'd been taught that plastics last hundreds of years. And I knew that was a straight-out lie. And I don't care enough about this whole topic. I don't care enough, to be honest, about the environment more than the next person. I'm not passionate about the environment. I'm not passionate about plastics as materials and the environment either. But I am passionate about not telling lies to kids, right? If we teach our kids a bunch of lies, they'll grow up to be A, confused, and B, to vote for very strange policies that don't make sense. So let's keep it real, people, and make sure that everything we say, especially the things we tell teachers, is true. So let's look at degradation. Here is a picture of a kind of a landfill, a dump where they put all the stuff. And one of the big knocks against plastic is they say, hey, it doesn't degrade. Well, that's a strange thing, right? Because landfills are designed to prevent degradation. And they've literally buried, they literally looked in landfills and dug down in them and found stuff from 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. Newspapers you can still read. I've got a whole book on it here called Rubbish. You can look it up on Amazon, right? Newspapers you can still read, carrots that look like they've just been buried yesterday, steaks, avocado, guacamole, everything you can imagine in there, 10 and 20 and 30 years old, good as new almost, because there's no oxygen down there. Landfills are designed to stop degradation because we don't want the carbon dioxide coming off, right? So this is a big misconception. People think plastics are bad because they don't degrade. We don't want things in a landfill to degrade. We want them not to degrade. That's why they're designed that way. And even the organic materials you think of as degradable, paper or food, are untouched. Okay, so there's one misconception. Here's a study on plastic bags. I was telling you about plastics degrading. So they took degradable bags, they took regular polyethylene bags, and they took bags which had a chemical put in them to make them degrade faster. They took all the bags, and all of them, So this is again quotations, right? I'm not putting any spin on this. Every one of the bags had degraded and fallen to pieces into, just dust in 9 months. Even a regular polyethylene grocery bag, if you leave it outside, not buried in a landfill, just lying on the ground, degrades and disappears in 9 months. So it doesn't matter whether it's a degradable bag or a regular bag, they all degrade because thin pieces of plastic like that degrade about as fast as a leaf would. It's the chemistry of plastics, they're organic polymers, and so are leaves, so are sticks, so is cotton, all of these things we think of, paper. It's all made of very similar chemistry and they degrade at similar rates. And they also found that many of these bags sold as degradable were in the ocean for, I think, 3 months. They pulled it out and they filled it with groceries, and it was as strong as the day it was put in the ocean. There was no effect. So the bags that they're claiming are degradable are not always degradable. And the regular polyethylene bags, there are 2 studies, and both of them show that the regular polyethylene bag degrades into fragments and disintegrates in less than a year. So that's not 100 years, is it? Or 500 years or 1,000 years like my kids were taught. They were taught an outright lie. The regular bags are degrading in less than a year. Okay, and all polymer scientists know this. I mean, if you look at the polymer stabilizer market, it's billions of dollars. We spend decades trying to stop plastics from degrading because it's one of the biggest problems that plastics have. All right, so let's look at some numbers here. If we take a PE bag here on the left, or PE bag, for example, film, it will degrade in soil in 1 to 3 years. That's what we see. If we look at a piece of paper, about the same. PLA, PHB, it's about the same. Leaves, carrots, steak, it's about the same, 1 to 3 years. These are approximate, but it gives you an idea. Do any of them degrade in a landfill? No, none of them do, because there's no oxygen there. Nothing's degrading. Do they release CO2 and methane when they degrade? Yes. So why are people so obsessed with these degradable bags, right? They want everything to be degradable. And degradable means, by definition, you're creating a giant amount of global warming gas. Does that sound like something to be encouraged? You're taking a PE or PE film, PP film, and replacing it with something which degrades to give CO2. And saying that's an advantage. I don't really see where the advantage is, especially when we know that life cycle analysis shows these materials are greener. Why would you move to a less green material that has no advantages and costs more? I don't really understand the driving force for that. And I know that you're going to say, well, are these degrading? Are they going all the way to CO2? How long does that take? Or are they just forming fragments? But as we've just seen, well, everything forms fragments, right? A leaf breaks in half, it forms microfragments, eventually it degrades all the way. I've got some data on that. But it's not important really, because leaves degrade into fragments, plastic degrade into fragments. Those fragments get smaller and smaller until the whole chemistry has been degraded. It takes a while for any kind of material. And we just saw that those microfragments are not really toxic anyway. Okay, so what's driving this whole thing, right? Well, there's a lot of deception and greed going on here. So the plastics industry is an industry, right? Chemical industry, that's an industry. Everyone hates big industry, right? Except for they produce all the materials we actually use every day and love, and makes our lives possible. What people don't realize is that the journalism industry, right? That's an industry too. They need clicks, they need to get revenue, and they'll write pretty much everything that gets a click without checking it and without caring. I'm not saying everyone does it, but as you saw from the straws and more fish than plastic in the sea, people repeat any kind of nonsense without bothering to check it. So they're making money, right, by deceiving us and making sensationalist titles. And the other people making money from this are some of the green groups are not really green groups. They're more like groups which will say whatever it takes to get your money out of your pocket. So let's take a look at one particular example. This is what's driving everything in the world, right? It should come as no surprise to you that just as plastics is an industry, this whole green thing is an industry too, and a lot of it's about money, and a lot of it's not really directed at helping the environment whatsoever. So here are some things about Greenpeace. These are some, these are headlines copied and pasted from online. So these are not accusations I'm making. These are just things taken from articles. They've been thrown out of many countries because they say these guys are not a valid. They're not a valid charity. They're not bringing us anything. They have no function. And so they're losing their charitable status in some places. And then there was another very interesting case where one company was accused again and again, and they eventually went to court. And Greenpeace's defense in court was that not to come with science, right? They didn't come back and say, here, everything we said was true, here's the science to prove it. No, they didn't have any science. Instead, they said that their statements were non-verifiable statements of subjective opinion. And I think everyone here can tell what that really means, right? So their defense was not to say we have science or that we're speaking the truth. That was their defense. And that tells us a lot, right? Apparently, they're more interested in getting interesting headlines and riling people up than they are in making sure that what they say is backed by facts. And that may come as a shock to you, but I mean, these people have $400 million a year, according to Wikipedia, if I understood it correctly. So why are they not just going and putting nets across these rivers and cleaning up the plastic and doing something? With the kind of funding these guys have got, they could be solving the world's problems on their own, but apparently they're more interested in getting the money than they are in solving the problems. So that's at least my interpretation of what I'm seeing here. So that's the problem. If we've got journalists who are not checking anything and we've got other people more interested in raising money than actually helping, that is not heading us in the right direction. Okay, so here are some conclusions. As we've seen, plastics, primarily polyethylene, polypropylene, and PET, are usually the greenest option, except for wood. If you were to replace them, you would do an incredible amount of damage, meaning vastly more CO2, vastly more energy, vastly more waste and water. Litter is 100% proven to be down to human behavior. So blaming materials or companies is, in my opinion, very naive and counterproductive. Ocean plastic comes from 10 rivers in Africa and Asia, and the rest from the fishing industry. That's pretty well established. Certain green groups and companies are doing more harm than good. And I think that, I'm not saying that we should be wasting, right? I think overall we should reduce waste. We should reuse things. We should dispose of things properly. And we should recycle more than we do now. And we should prefer the greenest material. And then we should recycle it, right? The people are doing exactly the opposite. They're taking metal and glass, which are two of the worst materials, and saying, hey, let's recycle those a bunch of times. Let's take the worst material I can find and use it again and again. No, we should be taking the greenest material, which is usually plastic, according to life cycle analysis, everyone, that I've seen, and then making sure we start with the greenest material to save the environment and then reuse it and reduce it as much as we can. That's the logical approach in my mind. So I think that's pretty much the end of it. And I'd like to leave you with one final thought. You can be for the environment or you can be against plastics, but you can't be both at the same time, right? Pick. I don't mind which one you pick. Everyone's an adult. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But if you actually do care about the environment, the facts say that plastics are the answer, not the problem.